All right, I know coming in on a Monday morning is a ongoing process, so thank you guys for getting here bright and early. You have a real treat. For those who hadn't seen it yesterday, our FTC Chairwoman Edith Ramirez literally took in the conference yesterday, and today we'll have, picking up that baton, our FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler, who will be here with us this morning, and then will give us our closing address. We, right now, in this moment of time in internet policy, are really blessed to have two leaders of these two important agencies who come with such great backgrounds and who are such wonderful individuals and who are friends of our program. And in a nice symmetry of sorts, our own Paul Ohm was a consigliere and a real tremendous asset to the FTC, and I was holding my breath that we would get him back, and we did. And apparently in that process he also convinced Chairwoman Ramirez to come out to Colorado to see why he was coming back, and I think she's been able to really get a sense of this world and is also interested in continuing a tradition of our students going to work at the FTC. We've had a number of them, including Ariel Brown last summer, who's the editor-in-chief of the Tech Journal. I don't know if Ariel's here somewhere. She's around. There she is, right there. For those who don't know much about the Federal Trade Commission, it's a special agency. We've had a great tradition of having that kind of dialogue here. We'll have the former FTC chair, Bill Kovacic, on the next panel. So without me taking any further ado, let me introduce Paul.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I apologize in advance that although this is labeled a fireside chat, there's no fire. I haven't worked with loading the Netflix Yule log up on the screen, but I decided against it. And good morning to you, Chairwoman Ramirez. Let me start with just a few minutes of introduction. The way this is going to work is we're going to have a dialogue, and then we'll save some time at the end for questions from you. So Mondays at this conference, there's always a kind of a bit of a hangover feel in the air because Sundays are such rich, intense, intellectually engaged days. And for some people, maybe literally a hangover feel in the air. But today, more than I think any Monday I can remember, you are in for quite a treat. The program today is amazing, and I'm very pleased to be kicking it off. I do also have one apology, which is I saw the chairwoman in her office last week in DC, and I said, the one thing I guarantee you is bright blue sunny skies, because that is Boulder's trademark. It may be cold, there may be snow on the ground, but you will see the sun. Oh, and I think maybe I may have a tiny bit of sunshine at the end. So I apologize for those of you from out of town, and please do come back. This year marks two momentous anniversaries that are relevant to this first conversation. So on September 26, 1914, President Woodrow Wilson signed the FTC Act, bringing into existence the Federal Trade Commission. So happy 100th anniversary. I look forward to watching the celebrations as they unfold this fall. And the FTC has produced many important and interesting and nation-shaping things for our country. It's also produced a long string of public citizens who have been of the kind of highest caliber. Examples to all the students in the room. I thank, as the Dean did, Maureen Olhausen for coming last year and this to our conference. Julie Brill spoke at my privacy conference a couple of weeks ago, and so looking at the webcam, Commissioner Wright, if you're listening, we're still waiting for you to punch your ticket here at Silicon Flatirons, but the invitation will come out soon enough. But the second, and in my mind, equally momentous anniversary that's coming is on March 4th, 2013, President Obama named to be the latest chair of this commission, Edith Ramirez. So your one-year anniversary is coming up in 28 days. Congratulations on that. Before that, she was a commissioner since 2010. And before that, she practiced a very interesting litigation practice at Quinn Emanuel and at Gibson Dunn in Los Angeles. Like the chairwoman, I'm from Southern California, and so I know that there aren't two finer law firms in Los Angeles, and it speaks volumes about kind of the depth of experience she brings to the job. Last night, reflecting on the chairwoman's first year, I went to the website and I looked at the news feeds and just was amazed to be reminded of the investigations and the reports and the settlements and the testimony and the speeches that this commission and this individual has accomplished. It was ridiculous. I kept saying, skip 10, and I still was only 6 months through the year. And this is an agency that has 600 attorneys, 80 economists. It is a small, compact, happy agency, one that I was blessed to spend some time with, and so thank you again for doing that. So the purpose of this morning is to reflect on some of the themes that we've been talking about, and in some ways to expand the conversation. So one thing that I want to start with is yesterday may have been the only time in the history of this conference that the words patent troll were not uttered once on the first day. You have, as I suggested, a rich background litigating patent cases. And to my mind, one of the big impacts of your first year is that there's been a renewed focus at the Commission on patents, and I guess you wouldn't say patent trolls, but non-practicing entities. There was a joint workshop with DOJ Antitrust. You've announced a 6B study to look at the question. So my first question for you is, why do the competition agencies think this is a good time to be focusing on this issue?
So let me start off first by thanking Phil for inviting me to this conference, and also just say that I'm delighted to be here. It's my first time in Boulder and my first time as a participant in this conference, and I was glad to see that I actually saw the mountains today, which I hadn't realized yesterday were right there. And just to also say that it's delightful to be here with Paul. When I first became chair, Phil reached out to me and he said three things. He was very kind. He congratulated me about my new position. He invited me to attend the conference, and then he said, "We want Paul back." And I think we know that that was really the main motivation for him reaching out. So it really is, and we had a terrific time having Paul at the agency. We learned a great deal from him, and I want to take this opportunity to thank you for that. Turning now to the question that you asked about, why are the antitrust agencies interested in what we refer to as patent assertion entities? And before I get to that, I'd like to just talk a little bit about sort of the lead up to the current work that the FTC is doing in this area. And one of the main reasons is because it highlights, I think, a very important role that the agency plays, particularly now that we are in our 100th year and celebrating the origins of the FTC, and looking forward as to how, what the next 100 years will look like. And the antitrust agencies have been really focused on IP for a long time. We are really interested in the important role that IP plays in a number of different industries, and the agencies have been looking at both IP and the intersection of IP and antitrust law in particular. And the FTC has a very long history of paying attention to this particular arena. Back in 2003, we issued a major report on the patent system, and we looked in particular at the issue of patent quality. And we focused on some of the challenges that face and that you see in the IT sector in particular, where the norm, of course, is the fact that you have products that have many components in them. And in particular, we were looking at, the patent thicket. Although these days, your typical smartphone will have tens of thousands, or will implicate tens of thousands of patents. Some estimates are that they implicate as many as 250,000 patents. So we were looking at this question of, okay, what does that then mean for businesses and business strategies, and ultimately, how does that impact competition and innovation? And I was on a panel with Doug Melamed a few years back, and he said, "Look, this is not it's not a patent thicket; it's really a patent tsunami. And how does a business really confront that?" So that was the broad issue that we were trying to address and looking at and examining in our 2003 report. And in particular, we discussed the strategies that companies were employing as a way of dealing with this patent, at the time, patent thicket, patent tsunami these days. And what we saw was that companies were taking defensive strategies. They were filing patent applications, they were acquiring patents in order to be able to defend themselves against patent infringement lawsuits. And so we were concerned about this because it's not the ideal solution. You're shifting resources away from actual R&D itself to activities that are perhaps less, that are less productive, because you're now making an effort to just file lots of patent applications, and then and also you're focused on acquiring massive portfolios of patents. And we were focusing on the fact that we were seeing a lot of low quality patents, and we were concerned about the impact that has, again, on from a competition policy perspective, on competition, and then ultimately innovation. So then fast forward to 2003, we issued another major report on the patent system. And then let me also just say that this is an area where we collaborate very closely with the Department of Justice, and we've had the benefit of Carl's thinking on these issues, Joe Farrell, many others who've done a great deal of deep thinking about a number of these issues. So in 2011, we issued another report on the patent system, and this one focused more on the issue of patent notice and patent remedies. And on the notice part, we were really looking at whether patents were truly, in fact, disclosing what was covered under the patents and problems associated with that. On the remedy side, we were looking at the fact that there seemed to be an increase in outsized damages awards and what that means, and we were trying to we recommended various reforms, urging courts, as they looked at issues that relate to damages, to really try to align and think in more economic terms, try to align the application of patent damages law so that you were rewarding true innovation and you weren't really simply recovering, getting a reward that went beyond that. And you were really just rewarding the true economic value of the patent. As part of this 2011 report, we also took our first close look at PAEs. And we used the term PAE because we wanted to get away from the derogatory term patent troll. But we also wanted to distinguish this from more traditional non-practicing entities like universities and firms that are engaging in R&D and are engaging in meaningful transfer of technology. And this was an emerging business model, and so we were interested in that, and we were examining, again, we're looking at this from a competition policy perspective, and we were interested in examining, the costs and benefits. And so you have, in one story about PAEs, which is they enable small inventors and startups to be rewarded for the technology that they're inventing. And it's clear that they also face enforcement hurdles, so they may not be in a position to really monetize their patents as larger companies. So in that regard, PAEs can be a good that ultimately promotes innovation. But then on the other side, some who feel that PAEs have a more negative impact, they really are looking at the tremendous litigation costs that are being imposed, and they see that as being a tax on innovation. So we looked at the issue. We saw, expressed some concerns about some of the trends that we were seeing, but posed, essentially the question, raised the issue. And
now we have the 6B study.
That's right.
So for the students in the room, if I remember, Section 6B, broader subpoena authority to kind of conduct research projects. It's, in fact, one thing that I think makes the FTC a little distinctive. It's an interesting power that you have. So what do you hope to accomplish by sending out these requests for information?
That's right. So now we're looking at this more closely. We had this workshop, as you mentioned, in December that we did jointly with the Department of Justice. And what we're hoping, and what we found basically is that when you look at this issue, really what you see a few developments, but mainly you've seen an increase in the amount of litigation that's being filed by PAEs. But we realize that the data to inform a broader analysis of what's really happening and what the costs and benefits are of the secondary market and PAE activity, we needed a lot more information. So what we have done is that we announced this past fall a study that would look and examine more closely the PAE business model, and because we have the authority to compel non-public information, we're hoping to shed some light on some of these broader policy questions. So that's really the aim of the study.
Great. Well, thank you. So let's move on to the topic that I teed up yesterday, and I was kind of interested to see that other people throughout the day were already planning to discuss this, and this is the topic of Edward Snowden and the NSA. As you know, and as most in the room know, I'm primarily a privacy scholar. I think a lot about privacy issues. And while I understand full well that it is not even close to your jurisdiction to kind of opine on what the NSA does, it's also my observation that in the last year, the revelations about NSA have got people discussing and thinking about internet privacy in a way they haven't before. And at least to my mind, there seems to have been direct spillovers into lots of other debates touching on this, including consumer and commercial privacy. And so the question is, has the news influenced the way you think the agency is responding, the kind of dialogue and conversations you've been having? What effect has Edward Snowden had on your life individually? We're going to ask that of all speakers for the rest of the day, yeah.
So I want to just make clear what you've already alluded to, and that is that the FCC, we have jurisdiction over the commercial sector. So that's really how we examine issues relating to privacy. So let me just put that out there. At the same time, clearly the Snowden, the disclosures and the revelations about what's taking place at the NSA have had important implications. And on the positive side, it's been a catalyst, of course, for a very healthy debate about privacy generally. I mean, that includes privacy as it affects the commercial sector. And I think that's a very good, a benefit that helps us and make sure that it helps both us in terms of the policy, the broader policy discussion, but also, frankly, has alerted consumers to the importance of this issue. One of the difficulties when you're talking about privacy in the commercial sector is the fact that there's a lack of inherent transparency. Consumers often really just remain in the dark about what is happening when they go online, when you have all of this tracking and information is being collected and then later used. And so one thing that really does concern us is this lack of transparency. So I think this issue has really helped to put a spotlight on the issue more broadly and remind consumers that the technological advances have really enabled both the collection of just vast amounts of information, number one, and then number two, that the analytical tools that are being used and deployed to actually make use of that information are very sophisticated and advanced. So that's on the positive side. But let me also talk about the international dimensions, and this also was addressed.
This came up a little yesterday. The EU safe harbor kept getting invoked, but let's take some time to...
And so let me just spend a couple minutes on this question, because for me and for the FTC, it really is just it's a broader discussion than just the safe harbor program, although that's important, and I'll get to the safe harbor framework. But the various number of different years, there has been a broader global debate about privacy, and the FTC has been a part of that debate. But the reality is that the folks, in Europe and in other parts of the world look at the U.S. and they think, gosh, the U.S. is, just a wasteland when it comes to privacy. They really just don't understand that we do take privacy seriously. And so, from the European perspective, they don't consider our privacy laws to be, quote unquote, adequate. And, they feel that, in Europe, privacy is a fundamental right, and they view it very differently. Other parts of the world have similar views and have modeled their privacy laws against the European approach. And so at the FTC, we have had a lot of engagement. I think this is an aspect of the role of the FTC that I think a lot of people really don't appreciate. And frankly, I didn't fully appreciate it until I actually got to the agency and really engaged in all of the international work that we do, both on the competition side as well as on consumer protection. But here, in particular, during my predecessor's tenure, John Leibowitz and David Vladeck, there was a real concerted effort to engage with data protection authorities in Europe and around the world and really tell them, look, we do take privacy seriously in the U.S., we do have this sectoral approach to privacy, but also the FTC has been doing quite a bit in this arena, both data security side as well as privacy, just using our general Section 5 authority prohibiting unfair or deceptive acts or practices. And so we were telling the story about how, we have Facebook under order, we have Google under order, and these, the actions that we've taken protect hundreds of millions of consumers, not only in the U.S., but around the world. So we were really making, I think a dent in getting this perspective to change. And unfortunately, come the spring, that dynamic with all of these revelations, and I say revelations, really just altered the dynamic again, and we went a little bit backward. And the issue now, as Larry was discussing yesterday, is how do we rebuild that trust? Now, and again, it's important because we want to be, the U.S. needs to be at a global level involved in these policy discussions, because we do approach the way we tackle privacy issues are a different way than, of course, the way they do in Europe. And we think that even though our aims are very much in line in terms of the need to have privacy protections, how we go about that is very different. And we want to have, a role at the table in talking these issues through, as you have a number of different jurisdictions who are enacting and implementing privacy laws around the world. And I do a lot of work, I've done a lot of work in Asia through the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, talking about these issues. So it's not just a discussion vis-a-vis Europe, it's a discussion that's global in nature. So then let me get to safe harbor. As a result of all of these renewed level of criticism, the safe harbor framework has come under attack, and also in particular, the enforcement piece of the safe harbor program has come under attack. And the way the safe harbor framework works is that it is administered by the Department of Commerce, but we at the FTC are the backstop enforcer. And we were criticized. The Europeans said, gosh, how many cases have you really brought enforcing the program? And I think people forget that the way the program was designed from the outset was that it was designed so that we would be getting referrals from European data protection authorities they would refer matters to us where there was a concern about the protection of European consumer data. And by the way, just to back up to make sure that everybody understands, so the safe harbor mechanism is one way that allows U.S. companies to be able to transfer personal data from the EU to the U.S.
Because earlier, European officials had said that we were out of compliance with their laws.
We are not adequate.
And we are not
our
adequate.
laws are not adequate.
So because of that, had we not created the safe harbor, no American company could.
Right. I mean, there are other mechanisms, but they're more burdensome. And so the safe harbor framework is one way. And so what companies do is companies self-certify that they're in compliance with these 7 principles that are aligned with the way the European privacy laws. So clearly, the safe harbor program is critical for U.S. companies. I mean, if you don't have this ability to self-certify and be part of this program, then you cannot transfer data. So needless to say, I mean, given all the, the important role and the amount of commerce that's taking place between the U.S. and Europe, that's a critical framework. And at the FTC, we see it as a very important mechanism. And it's come under a lot of criticism. Some people were even calling for safe harbor framework to be abandoned because they just felt that the U.S. couldn't be trusted, U.S. companies couldn't be trusted. And fortunately, we've done, I think, a good job of trying to address those concerns and working with the Department of Commerce. We're engaged in a conversation with the Europeans about what we can do to improve the program. We think that it's an effective program, that it works well, but there's always room for improvement. And the European Commission issued a report in the fall, and they made various recommendations, and we're now in the process of discussing those. And also, let me just also emphasize that given the fact that we, at the FTC, were not getting a lot of referrals, what we did is that we've now have now for several years been taking a more proactive look at this program in terms of our enforcement. And we recently announced a dozen new cases.
Right, but going back to your litigation days, you've now opened the door to the fact that one of the dozen that you brought was against the Denver Broncos, which I think not coincidentally was only a few weeks before the Super Bowl. And so now we know what was on Peyton Manning's mind, right? So I'm glad I got to air that. I was very unhappy with the commission. All right. At any rate, so you also brought up the work the agency does on data security, So I had a workshop here talking about ostensibly the NSA a few weeks ago, and I was astonished that every person in the room, save the 5 NSA surveillance diehards who were there, to a person, every one of them said, I care more about what just happened with Target and the 70 million or 100 million identities that were stolen than I do about the NSA. And that was a really interesting moment for me to hear that, and I'm still working through what that means. So let's shift to Target and other breaches. I mean, a little more generally, I know you can't talk about cases that may or may not be before you. Data security is in the headlines. It's essential. People are talking all about it. And obviously, it's running in parallel with a lot of activity about cybersecurity in Washington, D.C., which, in my opinion, is a pretty broken debate right now. So I want you to just describe kind of the FTC's role. Where does data security fit in? Talk a little bit about the enforcements you brought and what the agency is trying to accomplish through those.
Happy to do that. So let me just again emphasize where we come into the picture, because cybersecurity and data security are complicated issues that, frankly, that require solutions that are multi-pronged and that involve multiple players in the ecosystem. But where we come in is that our fundamental role is to protect American consumers and to promote competition. So here our focus is how do we protect consumers, and the way we look at this issue, and the reason that we also focus on we say, and we use the phrase data security, is that while the high-tech breaches are the ones that garner all of the attention, we're concerned about low-tech breaches as well. So a few years back, we had an enforcement action against CVS and Rite Aid where important health information ended up getting tossed into dumpsters, and that obviously is also a deep concern of ours. So we're concerned about this offline and online. But I think the reason that the Target breach is important, and by the way, in Washington there's a cycle where whenever there's a high-profile breach, there's a lot of interest in these issues, and so this is one we've gone through this before. We've seen this cycle before, and the FTC has been really doing a lot of work, particularly in the last decade, when it comes to data security, and we enforce certain sectoral laws, but then we also use again our authority under Section 5 as a mechanism and a means of addressing data security. And what we really, our main role is basically at the front end. We want to make sure that companies really take data security seriously, and that they make sure that they implement reasonable data security measures. That's really the core of what we're trying to do. And this is important because, number one, all of this takes place against the background where identity theft continues to be, a pervasive problem. The recent statistics that have been issued by the Bureau of Justice is that in 2012, 7% of the U.S. population has been a victim. 16 years and older have been victims of ID theft. So this is a huge problem, and at the FTC, it has been the top complaint that we receive over the course of the last decade plus years. So it's really critical, and then furthermore, in our experience, our enforcement experience, what we see is that companies continue to make just very basic fundamental mistakes when it comes to data security. And the data that we see that's out there corroborates that. Verizon issues an annual data breach report, and there too, basically 80% of the breaches really are the result of just very basic security measures. So it's important in that the issue has been elevated again, and allows us an opportunity to highlight the importance and what we think companies ought to be doing in this area. And then it's also important because it's given, the Hill is interested, Congress is interested again in taking action, and we at the FTC believe that Congress needs to enact a federal data security law that has strong protections on the data security side, and then also has a robust breach notification component as well.
Okay. So let's move on. One thing I noticed about the FTC is the FTC picks up on phrases before they're overused. And so I was always impressed by kind of the focus on what's around the corner. That's a theme we talked about last year at this conference. So let me put two on the table, both again related to privacy. So on the one hand, we have the Internet of Things, which we talked a little bit about yesterday. The idea that we're going to have sensors and sensor networks and the little devices that quantify itself. There are all these terms. So that's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, a term we didn't talk about much yesterday, big data. But one thing these two developments have in common is they have spurred arguments that they both spell the end of notice and choice, at least for privacy. The Internet of Things does it because how are you going to give notice on a tiny little device that has no user interface? Big data does it because data collectors no longer care about the primary reason they want their data. They care about the second and tertiary and quaternary, is that the right word, reasons for collecting the data. And they don't know those when they first collect it, so how could they give the consumer any sense of notice or choice to opt out? And so both have seen strong calls in recent days for, in general, us to stop focusing on notice and choice, and specifically for the FTC maybe to think about beginning to amend its approach to de-emphasize notice and choice. So what do you think in response to these? Do these two spell the end of notice and choice?
My short answer is no, no. But at the same time, look, I mean, privacy is a huge challenge, and it's a huge challenge for regulators, and it's a complex question. So one of the things that we do to really try to understand what's happening is that we hold these workshops as a way of engaging with all of the relevant stakeholders. We want to talk with companies who are developing products. We want to engage with academics. We want to engage with technologists, consumer privacy advocates. Part of an important part of what we do is just to listen and to learn, and so that's really the main objective with these workshops that we hold. Because as it came up yesterday, Brad Feld reminded us that it's not just the Internet of Things. We have to really think about what's happening, not just today, what's happening, tomorrow, a year, 5 years down the line. And so perhaps we shouldn't just be talking about the Internet of Things, but we should be talking about the Internet of everything, as some are now arguing. But more specifically to your question, I guess I see three main privacy challenges when we start thinking about the Internet of Things. And one is that you have this just ubiquitous, again, collection of information. That's one. Then secondly, you have these unexpected uses which can be, all of this can be very beneficial to consumers, of course, and there are tremendous benefits, both in terms of just convenience, but also the various, as you were, mentioning, the various possible, benefits that analyzing all this tremendous information can provide to consumers ultimately. But third, there's also a challenge when it comes to data security. I mean, data security takes on a whole new dimension when someone can, now hack into, every, day devices that you have in your home. So there's just much more opportunity for, malefactors to do all sorts of, engage in all sorts of malfeasance. So that's another issue. So we've got to be looking at all of this very carefully. As far as notice and choice, we understand that it's really difficult to make sure that consumers really understand what's happening, and that it is a burden on them. In fact, we've urged what we've recognized this by acknowledging that people just don't read privacy policies. I don't read privacy policies. I'm the head of the FTC. What can we do to acknowledge that, and how can we make sure that nonetheless that consumers are informed? So we've advocated simplified notice and choice, and we also advocate greater transparency, and we advocate privacy by design. And by that we mean that we ask companies to think about privacy when they're first developing a product or service, that they really need to be taking all of these issues into account. And I think that continues to be very important. So while it's more challenging today to provide notice, I think it's still fundamental to our entire way of looking at this issue, that consumers ought to have control over their personal information. And that means that companies need to be transparent about what they're doing, and they need to provide information in a way, just in time, as we like to say, so that something pops up when your device wants to use your geolocation information, for example. So I think it's still quite critical that we not abandon that.
That's great. So we started 10 minutes late. I'm going to eat 5 minutes into our break, and I will get to your questions in a second. We're going to continue the wiser tradition of calling on a student first. And I don't see a lot of you, so those I recognize, start thinking of one. So my last question is more about kind of process and procedure than the substance we've been talking about so far. So you've just been joined at the commission by LaTanya Sweeney, who is your third chief technologist after Ed Felton and Steve Bellovin. I know that you've hired technologists in the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection within the Bureau of Consumer Protection, and there are a few other computer science lawyers around the agency. So what are your reflections on this kind of experiment of sorts started by your predecessor into bringing more technologists into formal roles? Is this something you want to expand? At one speech I gave said, well, we have a Bureau of Economics. Why don't we have a Bureau of Technology? I don't know if you want to go that far at this point yet, but what are your thoughts about bringing technological knowledge into the agency?
It's not just an experiment. I mean, it's a necessity today. And we're looking at technology from a whole slew of different angles. So it comes into play not only when we're talking about privacy, it comes into play when we're conducting investigations on the competition side. So, for example, when we were conducting an investigation of Google search practices, it was really important to make sure that we had people who were well familiar with technology and have deep expertise, so that we know exactly what questions need to be asked. And we also have Andrea Matwushin from Wharton, who is in a senior policy role at the agency. So I see it as an absolute necessity. And so, and John Leibowitz really started bringing in a lot of this expertise into the agency, both by starting this position of chief technologist, but also in terms of our hiring. We want to make sure that in-house we have people who really have deep expertise in this area. It's absolutely critical because, again, one of my goals as chair is it's a challenge to stay current in terms of what's happening. Companies don't want to tell us exactly what they have in mind on these issues, and so we not only want to be current, we do want to be thinking, and we are thinking about what's going to be happening in a year, in 5 years. And so for us, it's really quite important. Sometimes there's just this sort of knee-jerk reaction that we get whenever we're looking at issues. The business community, others might say, goodness, it's these, bureaucrats from Washington meddling into these areas, and all you're going to be doing is stymieing innovation. That's not the way I see it. I think that basic consumer protections, can really help promote innovation, and it's important that consumers feel that they have control over their information, and I also want to make sure that the agency continues to look at these issues in a very sophisticated way and nuanced way, and frankly, one of the biggest parts of my job is to listen and to learn, and that's one of the reasons I don't have much time to do this, but I really enjoyed being here because I get to hear all of these tremendous ideas, and ultimately, what I'm thinking is, okay, how do these bigger debates, how does that then translate into the work that we are doing at the agency? So it's critical.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, so student with a question. See, one trick of the law professor is the awkward silence works in your favor. Thank you, Ariel.
Hi. So I guess my question would be, do you think that the focus that we have on privacy now and how everyone's thinking about it will encourage companies to self-regulate from the beginning as opposed to waiting for the FTC to step in because consumers are now demanding that?
Yeah, it's actually a perfect lead-in for the next panel, which is all about multi-stakeholder processes and things outside traditional regulatory structures. So.
Absolutely. I mean, I think consumer demand is actually critical in this area, and I think a number of companies are clearly already doing this. And the question for us is, how do we get as all companies to really be thinking about this? All companies that end up collecting and using consumer information. And look, we do have this dual mandate. We promote competition. We are protecting American consumers. So from our perspective, the more competition that we see in privacy, I mean, that just really makes us feel good. So that's exactly what we want to see.
Now, question for anyone, student or not? I've got others, but yeah. Carl, you want to wait for the microphone? We have a webcast, so thank you.
I'm just picking up on the last sentence you spoke, actually. Competition, I love competition. Competition in privacy. How can you be sure it doesn't lead to a race to the bottom?
Meaning a race to no privacy.
Yeah, to the weaker protections for consumers that actually is not ultimately the interest of the public.
I mean, look, at the end of the day, we want to see competition in this area, but then obviously there's a role for the FTC, and I also think that Congress should take action when it comes to privacy. I was talking earlier about this international debate. I think it would give us a lot more leverage and credibility if we actually had a federal privacy law. And I'm supportive of that. I mean, I think it's time. We can do a lot, and we have done a lot at the FTC with Section 5. But there are gaps and limits to what we can do, and I think it is time that Congress takes action in this particular area, and I think that would help us in the international efforts that we're also engaging in.
So we only have about a minute left. Let me ask you one other quick question, and if it's something that you need a lot of time for, take it if you need it. Many of your predecessors have called for the end of the exemption for FTC action on common carriers. I mean, is that something you share? You also think it's time for the FTC maybe to start looking at common carriers as well?
Absolutely. I think given where we are today, it's an exemption that really no longer makes sense, and I definitely support getting rid of that.
Great. Well, thank you very much once again for joining us. Please join me in thanking the Chairwoman.
How you doing, Tom? Nice to see you too. Sorry I missed that. We'll get another nice to meet you.